Hey everybody, and welcome back to a Discovery Club lesson for this week. And I want to remind you what it is we've been doing. And what we've been doing has been starting at the beginning of the Bible, as we did during Discovery Club this past year, and seeing the faithfulness of God as we work our way through the scriptures. And so we had gone through Genesis and Exodus and seeing the story of what's going on in God's people as he is showing his faithfulness to his people and ultimately his faithfulness to his creation. So we're going through that and we're learning the story. So we've been in the Judges, and remember the Judges were a time where there were no kings yet for God's people, but God was their leader as he intended to be. But there would be guys that men and women both that stepped into the role of leader. Especially as they kind of dealt with these conflicts with people around them. So most recently we talked about Samson, the big, strong, superhero kind of guy, although maybe not on character as much as just on ability. So we're still in the Judges, like we're done in that book, but during the same time, another book of the Bible, in fact, the next book of the Bible called Ruth, takes place. And it's a short story. It's one that's actually pretty good to just sit down and read and learn about what's happening. It doesn't take that long to just do that, maybe 15 minutes. And you can learn about this story of Ruth. And there's really two things I want to focus on as we tell the story during this time. And those two things are faithfulness, as we see, again, is kind of our theme of seeing what God is doing in the Bible, but also loyalty. Faithfulness and loyalty. So here's how this works. It starts off, I went and kind of looked at online at just like what happens if I Google search for Ruth and Naomi and the characters of the story. So I did that and I came across just some different art things, and so I printed off some of those so I could show you some of the ways that these characters have been depicted just artistically. So we have Ruth, and this is my one of our Ruth paintings that I printed off. And Ruth is the daughter-in-law of someone named Naomi. So here's the deal: Ruth is not one of the people of Israel. She's a Moabite, but she marries into the family of Naomi. So here's a depiction of Ruth and Naomi together. And what that means is, so Ruth is married to her husband, and her husband's mother is Naomi. Now, Naomi had two sons, and both sons were married, and then this tragic thing happened. Their sons were killed. Naomi's sons were killed. And so what was left was no more family for Ruth or for her sister-in-law. It was just the two women and their mother-in-law, Naomi. Now, typically what would happen in this case, and what kind of intended to happen in this story, is that Naomi would say to them, go and find a new husband, go and connect to a new family. You're not responsible for me anymore. Well, Ruth decided that wasn't okay. We talked about faithfulness and loyalty. Loyalty is a great characteristic of Ruth, because what Ruth did was she said to her mother-in-law, wherever you go, I will go. Whatever you do, I will do. And I will be your family no matter what. So Ruth and Naomi take off to go back to where Naomi is from, Israel. All right, so they go back, and again, now Naomi's husband had died, now her sons had died, so Ruth is no longer married, and the two of them are trying to figure out, how are we going to take care of ourselves? Well, there's this kind of interesting law, cultural kind of way of doing things among the Israelites, and what it is this: when someone dies and their wife is left behind, there was someone in that person's family that would then marry the widow, the woman who's left behind. Because remember, in this culture, women couldn't do a lot of things, and so therefore they needed a husband to provide and to take care of them. Unfortunately, that was a part of the culture of the time. So Ruth then finds out about this guy named Boaz. And here's another depiction, just another painting, another picture that someone has made that could have been Ruth and Boaz. And she approaches Boaz, who the Bible says is a person of noble character, and approaches him about being that, what is called a kinsman redeemer, being the one who might marry her and take care of her family. And he is a person of virtue. He's a good person, and he says, yes, I will marry you and I will take care of your family. But then he finds out that there's another person in the family that could be closer, and there's kind of that mess until it finds out that that person didn't want to do it anyway. So as we go through this, what we see is the loyalty of Ruth that sticks with Naomi, her mother-in-law, no matter what. We see the virtue of Boaz as he is willing to step up and to take care of these women and make them a part of his family. And what he sees is also the virtue of Ruth. And so good people making good choices for the sake of their family. And finally, what we see is this picture. A Ruth and Boaz now having new children and new family. And there in the middle is Naomi with her new grandchild. Now, what's interesting about this story is we see those kind of faithfulness and loyalty and virtue all kind of weaving their way through the story. But what's also interesting is God isn't mentioned a whole lot. But what it does is it shows us that God is a part of what's happening in the lives of these people. And especially we see God's hand at work as people are making choices that are consistent with his character. So when Ruth and Naomi and Boaz are reflecting the character of God, they're being virtuous, they're being good, they're being kind, they're being selfless, they're being loyal, they're being faithful. When those things are reflected in them, we see also that God is working to bring about good in their lives as well. And we see that throughout history, that God is working to bring good into the lives of his creation. And when we try and reflect his character, we often have a chance to see some of those things happen for us. Not always. The loss and the tragedy that happened at the beginning of Ruth is still loss and is still tragedy. But God is working to redeem. He's always working to make things better. Now, here's the other cool thing about this story. It sounds just kind of like a random story that might teach us about loyalty and teach us about virtue. That's all good. But at the end of the story, there's a genealogy. And what it shows us is that if things didn't happen the way they happened in this story, we would not see what we see in the future. So what we see at the end of this book is that these people, Ruth and Boaz, had children who had children who had children, who eventually led to one you may recognize, King David. The David who killed Goliath with a sling, the David who led as king, and the David who was also in the line that leads to Jesus. So this isn't just a random story about random people. These are people that are a part of the line that leads to God sending his own son Jesus into the world to die and to bring us restoration. So, very important story. Like I said, it's a short one. It'd be a great one to sit down with your parents and read and to learn about these characters who God was working in and through in the midst of their tragedy, in the midst of their choices, and as we see them redeemed and see their lives begin to get better. So that's our story for today, and we will continue in the coming weeks as we go forward in the Old Testament and into what more God has to do as faithful as he is to his people. All right. Have a great week.